David is a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT. He's a professor of glass, and he's here in Corning actually teaching a class at our educational facility, which is called The Studio, which is just across the parking lot. And he's going to be doing a special demonstration for us tonight that's going to be live streamed on the internet, so we're going to say hello to our viewers at home as well. And this is kind of an extension of the class that David has been teaching for the last 4 days. So I'm going to make some introductions here. We have a fantastic team here at the museum. David's going to be assisted by Tom Zogas. Tom's here as David's TA. Yeah, let's give Tom a round of applause. And we've got the home team here, G. Brian, Lucas, Rebecca. And we have a special guest tonight. We're actually joined by Dr. Jane Cook, and she is our chief scientist here at the museum. How about a big round of applause for Dr. Cook? And she's going to be really providing us some really invaluable insights into the scientific explanation as to what's happening as we move through this demonstration. So it's going to be exciting. We're going to have part performance, part experimentation, part teaching practice, all combined into one awesome show. So I'm excited. You guys excited? Awesome. Everybody at home excited? We don't really know, but I'm sure they are. So David's going to be making some goblets, some traditional hand-blown goblets. So this is where the whole show starts. Now, I've seen some of the goblets that David has made in the past, and they're pretty amazing, really finely crafted, really extreme attention to detail, and tons of training goes in to be able to make those goblets so precisely. So he's getting a lot of assistance from Tom. He's been working with Tom all week, like I said, and probably for the last few years. So you really rely on your assistants quite a bit. And after a while, when you work with the same team, you really don't have to say too much. You know, everything becomes kind of a logical set of steps to get to the same outcome. Now, a couple things about our stage here as we get going. We've got a camera behind the furnace, so you can see what's happening inside there. That's 2,000 degrees. It's powered by 2 big natural gas burners on the side, and the camera sits behind a little window. So we're going to get some really cool views when he's in there. Now, part of David's class is really about, you know, how to make things really well, and then different ways to unmake them. So you've probably noticed by now we've got a large glass bucket behind the bench with a microphone sticking into it. Once David goes through this entire process of making this beautifully crafted goblet, he's actually going to place it in the bucket of water. And we're going to measure certain things. We're going to measure sound, and we're going to measure the loss of heat. And maybe, Dr. Cook, if you could explain a little bit more about that process and what we're looking for.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've worked with David now for about a half a year up at RIT. And I was consulting with a class that he was doing up there. And trying to looking for different ways for glass artists to incorporate some of the science and engineering of materials into their work. So I used to work for Corning Incorporated, the folks up the hill, for about 16 years as a research scientist. And so it was really cool for me to see an artist who was so interested in understanding a lot of the finer points of what happens to the material as he works it, but also as it fails. So understanding how does glass break and what can you learn from that. And no better way to break a piece of hot glass than to dunk it into a bucket of water, as we'll see, and hear. And it was actually that those two combinations of seeing how does it break and then listening to what it breaks. There's actually an entire branch of engineering called Acoustic Emission Spectroscopy, which is just a fancy way for, say, listen really carefully, right? Listen with a machine, and you can learn about why it broke. And so David's taking that to a really interesting artistic level to probe the why his glass breaks and then use that as the art itself.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially when you take that into an educational context and try to encourage students to experiment with failure, I think is really helpful in the long run, and not see these objects as so precious sometimes, and be able to kind of play around.
Young art students can be so focused on learning technique that they kind of lose sight of the broader understanding that it's not just about getting things right, it's understanding why things went wrong.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, that's very exciting, and I know you've traveled up to RIT quite a few times to kind of work on this with both David and Michael Rogers, who's also a professor at RIT. So it's one of the nice things about living here in Corning. We have some of the world's finest glass programs an hour and a half away. We have RIT. Alfred University is also about an hour west of here. So we have kind of this triangle of glass knowledge, which is really exciting, especially here in the summertime. You know, we've got the world's best instructors come to sleepy little Corning to teach every summer. And so living here, we get to kind of experience that as well. So right now, Tom's taking what we call a flash heat, just kind of giving that goblet cup that has optic ridges in it just a quick reheat. It's kind of in a holding pattern right now. If our glass gets too cold, it breaks. So we have to keep it warm. Warm for us is around 900 degrees. So here's a punty transfer. A light tap, it breaks free. Yeah, let's give David a round of applause. Yeah, it's kind of tradition here in this amphitheater when we punty it, because that's never something you want to take for granted. Even with all of our experience, it can certainly go wrong right there.
Yeah, you can't be a good glass maker unless you're also a good glass breaker.
That's true, yeah. We break glass at least twice during a piece, sometimes more. And those are intentional breaks. So that constriction that David just made, you can see we have a small opening left where the blowpipe was. And that's called the neckline or the jack line. And if you've ever broken glass at home, you know it never really wants to break in a straight line. And by making that constriction, we can control how and when it breaks. And I'm not sure what the science is of that. I know that when it breaks, it's conchoidal cleavage. Is that right?
That's a fancy word for a particular type. But
okay.
Yeah, glass is actually a really strong material when it's pure and perfectly made. But it always breaks where it's the weakest. And so just like if you've got a piece of paper with score marks in it and you tear it, it'll tear at those points. Or if you've got a chocolate bar or a cracker that's got a perforation or a thinner part on it, you can always break the chocolate bar right at the weak point. This is very much just like, you know, putting in a line to guide the crack so it always follows those weakest links, those little cracks and lines that you put into it.
Got it. Yeah, I like the chocolate analogy better than the paper.
Yeah, if it's got chocolate, that's good.
So David's just kind of stretched some material out. Oftentimes when it breaks free from the pipe, there's a little thick edge there, and we remove that. You've probably experienced this at home. You know, it's, in my experience, more enjoyable to drink out of a glass with a nice thin top. You know, it's easier to drink the liquid out of that way. So he just kind of cut that little bit of thickness off of the top, and he'll begin to open up the cup at this point. Now, once the cup is finished, it's actually going to go into this oven over here. This is called the garage, and it's holding at right around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. We call it the garage because you park the glass in there, and then you can take it out later. So we'll park the cups in here. We just position this a little closer so it's in the right spot. And we'll park the cup and then create the stem and the foot. Once those components are finished, then the entire goblet gets joined together hot. So we'll actually use glass to fuse everything together. That tool is called the Sophietta. It's basically a metal cone on a metal straw. And that allows us to inflate the glass even though it's no longer on a blowpipe. The cone kind of seats inside of a wide variety of openings, and we can puff it up. We call it puffing up the shoulder of the vessel, and it kind of thins it out a little bit, and it changes the profile in such a way that it makes it easier to get a nice, elegant profile at the top of the cup. So when we talk about goblets, I've got an example here that was made by one of our team. We have a cup, a stem, and a foot, and then there's different ways of joining these together. Traditionally, the connection, sometimes called an avolio, can also be used as a design feature in the piece, so those connections become part of the design. But they can either be made all in one piece off the blowpipe, or, as David will show us tonight, by pre-making the cup. That allows you to get a little more extravagant or a little more detailed with the stem and the foot, because you don't have to worry about keeping the entire thing on center all the way through to the end.
Probably take a second and explain, especially the viewers on the live stream, what it is when they keep seeing the orange circles on the screen that look a lot like the end of a Looney Tunes cartoon. Good. I'm anticipating our audience. So that's a very special view that you'll only see here at the Corning Museum of Glass or at our furnaces around the world, where the camera is actually located behind the reheating chamber. It's not in the chamber. Of course, no camera could survive being in there at 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. But there is a window at the back of that barrel, and separating the camera from that heat is actually two pieces of glass. One is a piece of soda lime glass like this, which is on the cold side. But on the hot side, there's actually a piece of fused silica, which is a very, very pure type of glass that can withstand very high temperatures for long periods of time. It's actually the same type of glass that's been used in spacecraft windows since the 1970s, so to be able to survive the heat of re-entry. So David's finished up his cup, has broken it off and retired it over to the garage where it'll stay warm and stable around 1,000 degrees. You're gonna make another cup?
Yeah, we'll usually make cups and then start assembling them one by one.
Okay, so he's gonna sort of mass produce, that is 2 cups, get them safely in the garage, and then he'll begin to make the foot-stem combination, bring them out, do the attachment, and then we'll do the science by dropping them into the water. Science, we're doing science.
Science. Love science. So David's going to start the process over again, again with a stainless steel blowpipe, quenching it in the water. I love the glass bucket. You can kind of see what's happening inside there. It's funny because we just broke our glass bucket a few days ago. We had one outside. But if you're just joining us at home, and if you're just joining us here at the museum, this is our guest artist, David Schnuckel, and this is how it all starts, with a stainless steel blowpipe. And we have a furnace here that holds 1,000 pounds of glass. There's probably about 700 pounds in there right now. It's a little bit low. And it sits inside of a ceramic crucible. So when he comes out, you'll see he's got this kind of gob of molten glass. And I wonder if it's possible, could we run that gathering animation for our crowd here? Yeah, this really describes what's happening inside there. The glass sits inside of a ceramic crucible. It's like honey in a pot, and we dip the blowpipe in and wind it on. Depending on the size or scale of the piece, we'll go in there for 3 or 4 gathers. In this case, that's enough glass to make the cup for the goblet. This is the Marver. It's a steel table, and it's one of our favorite tools. I think it's funny to think about a table as a tool, but we can shape the glass on the table and also chill it. We can strategically chill different areas. A little gravity centrifugal force helps to elongate the bubble. And you can really see, you know, when we have a glassmaker up here who's as skilled as David, there's no wasted movements. There's no wasted time. He's made these cups long enough to know exactly what the progression of steps has to be. And when you're working thin like this, you really have to be extremely efficient. You can't mess around. You have to know what the next step is going to be. Into the optic mold, and that creates a differential in the wall thickness. So we get those ridges on the outside, thick ridges and thinner valleys. And so when the light travels through those, it gets bent, refracted, bounced around, and it creates beautiful optical effects. So he's created this kind of knob on the end, and that allows him to create friction, so he can take those parallel lines and twist them up. Tom's right there ready to start the inflation, and that's really a great way to get a really nice uniform wall thickness, nice and thin all the way around. So Jane, when we finish this goblet and we put it in this bucket of water, what are we going to measure?
So he's got it instrumented in 2 different ways. There is a thermocouple, which is a fancy electronic thermometer stuck in there right now that's currently reading 22 degrees Celsius, or about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And then he's also got the microphone set up very close. So you put something hot into something cold, the cold thing gets hotter and the hot thing gets colder, of course. But of course, in science, we have a special name for that, and we call it calorimetry, which is measuring the calories, measuring the heat.
I do that too. I measure calories all the time.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
You're constantly burning them, and then things are happening. And that, in a laboratory setting, everything would be very carefully calibrated, and you could learn something about the way that the heat was transferred and what the material was. In this case, it's more of it's a reference point for him, again, as an artist, just noting a certain amount of change. And he could say, well, how hot was it? Because you can tell how hot it was, even though we don't have a thermometer on the glass, by seeing how hot the water got. You're seeing the effect rather than the cause, right?
Oh, interesting.
So the other thing, though, is the microphone. So actually seeing as things break, you know when something breaks, you can hear it, right? Because there's energy that gets stored inside of it, and then it's released, and that release of energy causes a sound. Well, it's very much like a guitar player plucking a string. You put the energy in, and then when you release it, the string vibrates. And if you release it really hard, even the string will break. In this case, he's going to take that hot thing and put it into the cold, and that's sort of like pulling the string back. And then when the glass breaks, you're ringing the glass, but you're ringing it so hard that it's falling apart.
Interesting.
In a sense, you're going to make the glass into a bell that rings itself.
I like that analogy, the pulling of the string back.
Because you put that stress, that tension into it as the hot thing goes into the cold. Instead of like in a Prince Rupert's drop, as you might do in some of the demonstrations here, the Prince Rupert's drop stores the energy until you break the tail and the whole thing explodes. All this glass here, this tempered glass, has an enormous amount of energy stored in it. And if we broke it, it would break much more explosively than just a sheet of glass. He's going to store the energy, but before it can actually take it out and do something with it, the energy is also then going to release as it breaks, and we'll hear the sound. And we'll hear the sound of it breaking. We'll hear the sound of the water boiling. It'll be just a symphony of failure.
I love it. And I'm sure we're going to record this so we can kind of examine it later as well. We've got an amazing AV team here at the museum. Obviously, we've got the mic in the bucket. We've got, mics all over the stage to pick up all these amazing sounds. So here comes the second transfer. David just made that punty. We call that the punty, the handle that sticks onto the bottom of the Evolio. A light, ever so light tap. Yeah, we can give a round of applause for that. Punty is really important, and it's one of the hardest things to kind of wrap your head around when you're beginning. But when you're making work, you always want to work with assistants who are at least as good as you, and hopefully you can work with assistants that are better than you, because you really put a lot of trust in them, to bring that over at the right time, right temperature, to get it back into the reheating furnace quick enough that it doesn't shatter and explode.
I'd noticed that David was tapping the cup with his tweezers there after he received the punty back. And I was wondering actually if he was testing to see if maybe the cup itself had cracked during the transfer. Because a skilled ear, you can hear something that's broken even though it hasn't failed all the way. Instead of ringing true, there'll be a little bit of a thunk to it. Because some of the energy, instead of ringing like a good bell, it's going into the crack, just sort of flopping around. He said, no, there was actually just a little chip of glass inside, and he was trying to tap the chip out of the inside, but it's not cracked. The glass blowers, glass makers, even technical people like me when I used to work in the laboratory, you get very carefully tuned to the sound of stuff breaking. Because it might mean that, well, the experiment's over, but it could also mean that there's something wrong with your equipment. Maybe your furnace has busted in some way or something. So it's not always a happy sound. Like if you're a parent, you get to know the sound of your own child crying.
Absolutely.
You get to know the sound of glass breaking.
Yeah, I think that's something we all try to do is when we're making something new, or even when we're making something we've made 100 times before, is you listen for that thing that sounds different than it's always sounded. And when you hear that, usually something's gone wrong. And because you've done everything else the same, it makes it easier to troubleshoot what's gone wrong. You try and kind of limit those variables in a way that you can troubleshoot.
It's an interesting commentary on what, I mean, you're a glassblower, Eric, you understand this also, that you're so involved, you're so sensitive to what's going on with the glass after years and decades of experience, that very small deviations, you're trained, your hands, your eyes are very trained to pick those up.
Absolutely. And you know, one thing I've noticed, and I've heard you speak a little bit about this, is when we're working outside, we all sort of believe that the humidity changes things. And maybe it's just because we're sweating so much that our hands get slippery. But there is some kind of change in the way the glass works. Would you agree?
I do.
Okay,
yes.
That's good to hear.
That's one of the things that I do as a scientist with the artists is confirming that they're not crazy.
We appreciate that.
Or letting them know that they are. I mean, there's a flip side to that.
Looks like we're getting a question online here.
So we have a question coming in about whether or not there's a slim, emphasized slim, chance that the piece could go into the water and not explode. It's certainly possible if it was a simpler shape. But for something like this, it's going to be so complicated with all these cuts and joints and everything. There's so many different ways for it to fail that one of them is bound to happen. It's essential. I would give it a 0 probability.
I would agree with that. And that's one thing you struggle with when you're beginning to make goblets is, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 places it could fail, and then if you've chilled the stem too much, it's going to fail too. But typically as a beginner, what happens is you go to break it off of the punty and just the cup comes off because that connection isn't strong enough. Or, just the foot breaks off. You never break off the whole goblet until you've been able to kind of fuse all those elements together. And really the weakest connection should be this last one where that punty holds onto the foot. So here's that Sophietta again, just to kind of puff up the shoulder of the cup and get the profile that he's after. That's such a great camera view. You can really see those optical ridges in the glass. And this isn't a bad camera view either. Have any questions in the crowd so far? Anything I can answer for you folks here? Okay, please let me know if you do. Happy to answer questions as we go. This is part of our guest artist series here in the summertime. Like I mentioned before, we have the world's best instructors come to Corning to teach at the studio. And so when we have the opportunity to, on Thursdays, we'll invite those instructors into our hot shop. We call this the hot shop here, to do these demonstrations. So great way to expand our knowledge as well. As the team here, we're always watching and learning from all of the visitors here at the museum. And it looks like we have some glass blowers here in the crowd tonight too. Are you guys glass blowers up here? Yeah, I thought so. The glass blowers always sit up top there so they can look down onto the bench and pick up all the tiny movements that are going on. Did we have a question? Yes, sir. I'll come right over. Yeah, go ahead. Sure, yeah, I can start that off, and then I'll refer to Dr. Cook as well. The glass that we're using, the question was about the quality of the glass we're using and the characteristics. We use a glass called soda lime glass, and it's made from, look at this, We've got them right here. We've got silica sand, soda ash, and limestone. And I believe it's 70...
70, 20, 10.
Thank you, thank you.
Roughly.
70, 20, 10.
And for people, soda ash is kind of an archaic term. It's essentially baking soda that you've cooked a little bit, or if anybody does sort of old school washing, it's washing soda. Not borax, but washing soda.
So we'll get right back to that question. I just want to pause because we're just going to put this cup back in the garage here, and then once that's tucked away, we'll talk. We could talk all night about different kinds of glass, I think, right, and the different properties they have. But David's using some straight shears to chill that connection. He's first kind of used a hot torch to soften it, and he's kind of crimping it to make the connection smaller, and then we should just have a light tap, and it'll pop right off.
Blink.
There we go. So Tom's going to scoop that up on the forks, and there is cup number 2, safe and sound. Awesome. But yeah, soda lime glass, I think it's the most common type of glass in the world. Like these windows are soda lime glass. Most of your wine bottles, Coke bottles are soda lime glass. But our glass is designed, the ratio is designed so that it stays hot for a long time. Because we work it by hand, we need that time at the bench. It might not seem like a long time, but if you compare 30 seconds to, a split second that it takes for a Coke bottle to be blown into a mold by a machine and then popped out, it has to set up immediately. So our glass is what we call long compared to that bottle glass, which we would call short, the working time, with those two formulas.
And learning how to do different glass formulation is, it's a career for a lot of people, and the folks at Sullivan Park or up at Corning Incorporated and at other glass manufacturers around the world have gotten training at places like Alfred University, for example, to know, sort of like how a chef or a baker knows how to make different types of cake. You can have an angel food cake or a devil's food cake. They're both cake, but well, I'm going to add certain amounts of different things in order to make it behave in a certain way when I cook it. So learning how to make glass that's really good for glass blowers, like Eric was saying, that's very long and workable, as opposed to something like a bottle glass or a window glass that you want to just set up hard and get in out of the machine so another 500 bottles can get through in the next minute. They're all still basically soda lime, and they're all certainly glass, but you can tweak that formula to make it do what you want it to do.
And some of us that work here actually worked in this room. This used to be where the Steuben glass factory was, and we get asked a lot, what the difference is between crystal and glass. And crystal is glass. It's not a naturally forming crystal. But I think it's a really cool story, and it kind of relates to these goblets as we look at David's drawing of what his stem and foot combination will look like. That's really tricky to get the proportions right. You make the cup first and then kind of match the proportions to that. So he's going to get started on building that. But to my knowledge, the first use of crystal was actually by the Italians, who were the first ones who figured out how to make really nice clear glass by adding different decolorants.
Actually, they had a glass that they called Cristallo, but it wasn't the same as the leaded crystal.
That's right.
So that was invented by an English glassmaker about 300 years later.
Yeah, that's right. So the Cristallo was clear, but not what we would consider a crystal today.
It was still what you would call soda lime. They were just the first ones how to figure out how to make
clear
soda lime
glass
very, very clear.
Yeah. So Cristallo was a marketing campaign, right? It was a way to sell this new, really clear glass.
In the same way that, unfortunately, the British glassmaker called their stuff crystal, even though it wasn't a crystal, and scientists like me have been trying to get people to understand it. It's crystal, but it's not crystallized. The glass isn't crystal, but it's a crystal. It's it's unfortunate.
I think it's a way to compare it to a luxury good, right? It's a way to compare it to gemstones and things like that.
Right. Glass has always had a lot of value, actually, since it was invented, as something that looks like a semi-precious or precious stone, and it was kind of just part of its legacy that it would end up being named after one of those semi-precious stones at some point.
Right. And maybe you've heard this story too. The story I heard about lead crystal was it was invented in England. Was it Ravencroft, I believe, was the first company?
That's the first company to manufacture it
commercially. But it was a way to lower the melting temperature because they had to use different fuel sources at the time.
Yeah, I've heard that was what the motivation is.
Okay.
Because there's different. If you just tried to melt just the pure sand, it takes like a lightning strike or a hydrogen torch or something extremely hot to do it. So we add these things to it to make it melt at a lower temperature, like the soda, the sodium carbonate, or the lead or the borax to it. In the same way that like adding salt makes your ice melt at a lower temperature, adding these other things to the quartz makes it melt at a lower temperature.
So there we've got a nice detail shot of what we sometimes call a knop, which is the transition between the goblet cup and the stem. And you probably noticed David divide that gather of glass up into 4 lobes, and then by twisting those lobes, he gets that really beautiful spiral pattern. I was talking to David earlier, and he's been over at the studio for the last 4 days making goblets, and even the studio across the parking lot uses a different kind of glass. So they melt a glass called spruce pine, and over here we use Spectrum. And so just between those 2 very similar brands, we have much different working properties. So David was actually saying he's a little more familiar with our type of glass over here that's actually a little bit shorter than the spruce pine batch that they use at the studio. So in some instances, you know, you get used to one thing, and immediately switching over to a longer glass isn't necessarily a great thing. It requires an adjustment in terms of your timing. So there's our bit of fresh glass. So we'll have to see exactly how this shapes up, but I think he's going to elongate it into kind of this hourglass shape that will then be the base for the foot.
This part of cup making is always really interesting to me, Eric, because it seems like you can very quickly make something large, like the cup itself, because you inflate it. But this sort of detailed bit-by-bit sculpting, essentially, not sculpting an animal or a flower or something, but sculpting something like like turned wood on a fancy table.
Yeah, exactly.
But doing it piece by piece by piece.
Yeah, like a wood lathe or like a sideways potter's wheel.
The human is becoming the sideways, the potter's wheel or the lathe.
And I think most glassmakers would agree. It's like we call it like having a different set of hands. You know, you have one set of hands for the blown work, and when you're making solid glass, you kind of put on a different set of hands because the timing is different. The glass is staying hotter because it's solid, so you kind of have to go into a different mode of thinking. It's a MAP gas torch. So with that, David's able to heat up very small specific areas without getting the whole piece off center. So we can just heat up the very end, make it nice and flat, because he's about to drip a bubble onto the stem to make the foot. So that's what Tom is starting. Tom's starting another gather on another stainless steel blowpipe. And he's going to switch off with David, who will inflate the bubble. So he's kind of chilling the sides on the steel, but not the tip, and that's because he wants the bubble to shoot through to the tip. And you'll see that happen. He's holding it up. See the bubble kind of shoot through those cold sides, kind of reaching for the hot stuff at the end. Any other questions out here in the crowd? Yes, sir, go ahead. How do we add color? Yep, great question. Yeah, we're working all with clear here tonight. So a couple of different ways. This blue glass we actually melted here in our furnace. And every color that you can see all these different colors. It's a different combination of elements from the periodic table. So it's like a different chemistry that makes the colors.
Yeah, it's like the cooking analogy again, that you have different spices on your spice rack that but it's not like, something ways to make sure people understand is it's not like adding dyes to a paint or adding dyes to make Easter eggs. for any color to happen in glass, there actually has to be a chemical reaction. The elements that we add in the different forms dissolve in, just like salt dissolving in water or sugar dissolving in water. And only after it dissolves does it actually take on the particular color that you're interested in.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's
like the
interesting.
cobalt blue or the copper blues or the chrome greens.
Huh.
You're actually dissolving the atoms into the glass itself.
So they're soluble, kind of.
That's exactly the word. They dissolve into the glass.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
See, we're learning here tonight too. Thanks for the question. Yeah, that's
I
great.
didn't want this to be a science lecture, but you're a good student. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, so each of the colors, like copper blue, made with either black copper oxide or copper carbonate. This is relatively inexpensive, but when we get into like the pinks or the cranberry colors, those are made with gold chloride, which when we buy that color commercially, the price fluctuates with the cost of gold. So we try and buy when it's low, and kind of stock up. Although it just seems to go up and up anymore. So here's our blown foot. Tom is bringing that over nice and hot, and David is going to attach it to that stem. And because those two pieces are really hot, they're going to fuse together.
This is one of those things that the first time I saw a glassblower do it, I had no idea what was going on. How in the world is that going to be a foot, Eric?
Yeah, it looks like an onion or some kind of root vegetable.
Yeah.
So it was made the same way as this one. So what we need to do, what David will do, is make a constriction. And when he makes that constriction, he's also determining the size of the foot. So he starts with something larger, and he makes that determination, again, based on proportion. So when he removes this little bit of glass, he'll be left with the amount of material he needs to get that size foot. Perfect. Now there's a small opening there. So you can start to see how this logic repeats itself. This is the same way we made the cup in the beginning. We have that small opening. We'll superheat the opening and then dive in there with some steel blades and flip it open into a nice round disc. So G. Brian, just let me know. We've just turned on the microphone on the bucket. So we've got live sound coming from the water at this point. Seems a little quiet at this
Water
point.
music, yeah.
So you can see just in that one reheat, David was really able to kind of open that up quite a bit. Once he gets that, there we go. Once he gets that finished up, then we'll attach another handle to that and then attach the cup. So you can just see what a tremendous amount of work goes into making these goblets, that when you see a good one, they look effortless. It looks like it just kind of made itself. You don't see a lot of tool marks or really a lot of evidence of the hand, which I think is something that David strives for when he's making these cups. He's really striving to make a really well-crafted, well-considered object. And then, to have kind of the courage to say, it's not that important after all of that, and kind of examine how it fails at the end, I think is pretty exciting. So it looks like Tom is making the punty once again. And there's so many different types of punties and different applications. Sometimes we actually roll the punty through some dirt on the floor if we only want it to hold on for a very short amount of time. That's called the dirty punty. Sometimes we need the punty to hold on for a very long period of time if we're making a really large piece. Those are sometimes called sculpture punties. So again, as you kind of work for years and years and years, you develop this kind of repertoire of different punties for different situations. So David attaches that right to the center, and he's got just a second to kind of center it up if he needs to. And then a light tap, it breaks free. Yeah, round of applause.
David told me that he's actually going to crack off from this punty directly into the water. So they're going to attach the cup, and then instead of like cracking off to a board or something and then dunking it, they're just gonna tap it in.
So this will be our final punty and the delivery vehicle for the bucket.
Yep. Oh, Tom's gonna do a cup punty to take out of the garage, it looks like.
This might be a dirty punty right here, to punty into the inside of the cup.
Well, he didn't put it on the floor. Oh, he did it on the sill.
Just before he went in, right?
Yep.
Just a little bit of that kiln shelf.
Yep. So this is a dirty punty, ladies and gentlemen. You saw it here.
It's a technical term.
Live stream, dirty.
So it looks like David's using that MAP gas torch to remelt the top of that stem. So they probably won't use another bit of glass. They'll just remelt the stem to attach it all together.
So I also had a request from David that when he does put it in, he'd like there to be silence for about 30 seconds so we can all just listen to what's going on. So we're going to go quiet on the live stream while this is going on, and we'll just let the glass have its say.
Maybe a couple minutes.
A couple minutes, perhaps. So sit on the applause for a bit.
How do you feel, Tom? Come on over.
Look at that. That punty comes right off. That's exactly what we wanted to happen. You know, a good dirty punty comes off when you just stare at it hard enough. They're just designed just to really temporarily hold the cup until it's in position.
So does anybody want this? So does anybody want to stop him from doing this? Do we need an intervention? I'm sorry. Now's the time. Okay, he's called it. So the second cup is going to be made almost identical. He'll try to reproduce the stem, but it'll be different when the way it's introduced. That they'll crack off from the cup punty rather than from the foot punty. So it'll go into the water in a different way. No. So if we knew exactly how much water was in there, we've seen that the temperature actually went up about 1.5, 1.6 Celsius degrees, or about 3 Fahrenheit degrees. If we knew exactly how much water was there, we could actually back calculate how hot the glass was when it went in, because everything closes. There's only so much heat available. It all closed together on itself. My scientist colleague here, Rebecca, wants to go find it. She's going to calculate the volume and is going to do the math for us. I know she can. So interesting, forensically, it all did break. It just didn't all crumble, which is kind of an interesting thing. Although you could see it began to crumble as he tried to handle it. You could see where the places where, even though you have lots of cracking on the cup, it's sort of holding itself together, but just barely. It's not actually integral. You couldn't pick that up and pour wine into it. It would just dissolve or disassemble in your hands with any additional force on it at all. I like this.
I do too. For those just joining us here at the museum and at home, this is our guest artist, David Schnuckel. David is a professor of glass at the Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT, in Rochester, New York. And he is teaching a 1-week class at the studio, which is our educational facility across the parking lot from the museum, or on our campus, I should say. And we've just experienced the live stream sound and temperature experiment of breaking the goblet in the water. And so we've got one more goblet cup in the garage, and we're going to do everything pretty much the same, except at the end we'll kind of change the way that the goblet enters into the water and kind of compare how those two events are the same or different or both. Do we have any other questions here in the audience this evening? Okay, please let me know if you do. Happy to answer any questions. So here David is using the table to sort of form that round gather into a square kind of lobe. And he's going to go through these same steps where he uses the jack blades to divide it up into 4 lobes, and then he'll twist those into a spiral pattern. So that's how we get a solid optical ball, or one way we can. We can also use different molds. But this is, I think, a little more elegant to do it this way.
Is this an older-fashioned method of doing it, or just a house style for?
I honestly don't know. I mean, you get a different result, but I don't know. It would make sense, right, that you would do it by hand before you would make a mold to do it, but I'm not sure. We'd have to double-check that.
We'll talk to Bill Gudenrath.
That's a good place to start, yes. And for the viewers at home and for you folks here as well, if you get home and you have a question that's just bugging you, that you forgot to answer, you can email one of our librarians. And can you email a scientist as well?
If it goes into the library, it'll come around to me.
Okay, you'll find the appropriate
if it's a science
authority.
question, it goes to the right curator or librarian or to
Perfect.
me or the conservator, who's ever.
Perfect. Yeah, so check out the website, cmog.org. Tremendous resource for more information. The Raycal Library is the world's largest glass library, and just a wealth of knowledge there. We also have a YouTube channel, so we have a tremendous amount of content online, past artists, different classes, things like that. So you can really find a lot of info on the website.
And live streams.
And live streams, yep, absolutely. Check check out the social media channels as well. We're on the Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr. We've got a great social media presence and a lot of great content on there as well.
And she's right back here.
And there's Amanda. Hey, Amanda.
There's our social media presence.
And incidentally, if you're in the museum this evening and you're taking pictures on Instagram, use the hashtag #GlassApp, #GlassApp. And there's a chance that your pictures would be on the monitors in the new Contemporary and Design wing. That's how I get my work in the new Contemporary wing.
And once a month, Amanda puts together the 9 best Instagram photos and does a collage, and they get re-upped as official CMOG Instagram posts.
That's right. Yep. So check it out online for
So
sure.
do all your fancy shots of your kids climbing around on the sculpture out front. That's such an elegant move that he does with getting the temperature just right and then drops it and pulls it back up.
Yeah, I agree. You know, one of my old gaffers used to tell me that glass likes to wait. And sometimes it's nice just to let the skin form a little bit, let it shape itself up a little bit before you kind of make the move.
I get the question sometimes too is, what would it be like to blow glass in space?
I've wondered that myself.
Because if you don't have gravity, or if you can, or on the moon where the gravity is 1/3 or 1/6, or on Mars where it's 1/3, what would it be like to have a hot shop on the moon? How would that change the way that you work?
I think we should propose that project and
I think
get
so.
some funding, and I would certainly sign up for that. So we also get asked a lot, you know, are you able to reproduce things by hand, you know? And we absolutely can, and here's the evidence right here. I'm having a flashback of 15 minutes ago when David pulled out this stem, the exact same movements, the exact same amount of glass, and he'll get really close to the same result. Part of that is on the assistant, Tom in this case, to be able to control how much glass he gathers and how he's able to present it to the gaffer, to be able to bring over the exact same amount of glass at the same temperature to eliminate some of those variables for David.
I guess that's a skill that a lot of glass blowers build as they're coming up, working in a factory type setting still, right? There's still are places where glass is made by hand, high-end drinkware, for example, or designware like you do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. You know, there are handmade objects that are made in factories. I think when you say, is it made in a factory, is it made by hand? There are factories in the world that make things exactly like this by hand every day. And then there are factories in the world that make things entirely by machine. And then there's every iteration in between those two extremes. A lot of semi-automated processes as well. So Tom has just done a great job gathering that same amount of glass for the foot. And David's going to shape it up on the Marver table and then dip it into that same optic mold that he used for the cup. So again, chilling those sides, letting gravity make the shape more compact, and that bubble will shoot towards the tip. So Tom, again, is in the holding pattern. He doesn't want that glass to get too hot where it starts to move around again, so he's taking these really quick reheats. Luckily, we have this second reheating furnace over here, so he's able to keep a close eye on the temperature. He's looking at the color a little bit. He's making sure the color doesn't completely disappear. he can kind of feel the glass if it gets hot because it requires more torque to turn that pipe and keep it on center. As it heats up, you get this lag happening. So he's sort of really keenly aware of what's happening with that stem. That was a nice sound.
We got a little preview of the
Yeah, I like that sound.
of the acoustic emission spectrometer.
Now, sometimes when we do that, it doesn't sizzle the glass. I don't know if it's too hot or, sometimes we'll try and quench glass, but it doesn't do anything to the glass itself. Do you know why that might be?
That's something I'd like to do some research on, actually.
Yeah.
We call it crackle glass or ice glass.
Right.
It has a lot to do with the temperature that's going in and how much glass is actually there.
Yeah.
A lot of things can go right or wrong with that I'd really like to
A
explore.
lot of
more.
variables.
Yeah. But
So
here
this-
he's not trying to make any kind of a visual effect. He's just trying to get it quickly hard in one spot so he can grab it and
Right,
pull
so
it
we
and
can
twist
use
it.
that as
As a handle,
a
nice hard
structure.
handle.
Right. So he's using a blow hose at this point, inflating the glass through a rubber hose. That way he can really keep a really close eye on the wall thickness and get that really uniform, really even, maybe a little bit thinner at the tip than the rest of the wall. So David and Tom will trade up here, and here comes the foot again. So Tom's job is to get the foot really, really hot, almost to the point where it's out of control, so that he can kind of hang it down, and it'll drip right onto the bottom of that stem. And he's able to cut right through it with a pair of straight shears. Beautiful job. It's one thing I've always wondered about is what actually happens when that bubble gets dripped onto the stem, and if they actually fuse together instantly or if it takes a little while for them to kind of join together. Do you know, Dr. Cook, when we drop that foot on there onto the stem, do the two pieces actually fuse together like on a...
Ideally, at an
Ideally.
atomic level, they
At
are
an atomic level.
becoming a single piece of glass.
Okay.
It's one of the amazing things about glass is that it really doesn't like to be alone.
Huh.
Once it's hot and it's moving, it's fluid at that point. It hasn't solidified. And it just very easily reaches out and grabs anything that's like it and pulls it in and attaches itself to it. Self-welding.
Self-welding, another amazing property of glass. How's it looking there, G? Looking great. I see. Pretty tricky, yeah. So G was just telling me that the cup was in there upside down on the lip, so Tom had to first kind of knock it over really gently because he's punching on the inside of the cup. So you really have to be hyper-focused and really sensitive to the temperatures and the material. Beautiful foot. Look at that. He makes it look easy, doesn't he? Takes a lot of practice.
"15 minutes plus 20 years.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly it. We get that question all the time. How long did it take you to make this bowl? When you say 20 minutes, it doesn't sound impressive. But it's like 20 years plus 20 minutes. So we're getting close to assemble this goblet. Again, if you're just joining us at home, welcome. This is our live stream. Our guest artist is David Schnuckel. David is professor of glass at the Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT, and he is being assisted by Tom Zogas. And David is here for the week teaching a class at the studio, which is here on our campus. It's our educational facility. And if you missed the first piece, what David is doing is making these really refined, highly crafted objects and experimenting with different ways or different things that happen when he breaks them in different ways. So it's part performance, part experiment, and certainly an extension of his teaching practice and his own work as well. So it looks like Tom has our next puntee ready. That's the handle that will stick onto the foot. And that way, David can break the stem and the foot free from the shaping iron. A little tap, pops right off. And David and Tom have worked together quite a bit this week and before that, but you can still see them communicating quite a bit. And David's position here is what we call the gaffer, which is basically the head of the team, the leader of the team. I always equate it to the chef in the kitchen. And if you've ever visited a restaurant where they have an open kitchen and it's completely silent, maybe don't eat at the restaurant. You really want your team to be communicating openly so that everything goes smoothly, and you'll certainly see that happening here tonight as well. On the same, sort of idea, these guys have been over at the studio all week working in that setup, which is very different than our setup here. So when you travel as a glassmaker and you end up in a new hot shop, oftentimes it's like cooking in someone else's kitchen. All the gear is the same, but everything's in a slightly different location, and it takes you maybe an hour or so to get comfortable and familiar with it. So David says he's ready whenever Tom's ready, so Tom's going to work on bringing that last cup out of the garage. It's been in there for about an hour now, but because it's at 1,015 degrees, it's perfectly comfortable. We could leave it in there indefinitely, assuming we continued to pay the gas and electric bill, and the thing stayed on. We could leave it in there for a very long time.
Tom's got another dirty puntee.
Looks like we're ready for another dirty puntee.
Yeah, another door marver to make the dirty puntee.
Yeah, just a little bit of that dust from the kiln shelf. What it does is, because Tom is punting on the inside of the cup, we don't want gravity to pull the cup off center and have the side of the puntee stick to the cup. So by putting that dust on the outside, it doesn't allow it to stick. So the only part that's clear is the very tip of the puntee.
How do you feel, Tom?
So our starting temperature is going to be 23.4 degrees.
23.4 degrees Celsius.
And my able grad student will do our calculations for me. Yep.
So David's going to take a little time here, probably make sure the cup's running perfectly on the same plane as the foot, and then they'll sort of work out how they're going to deliver this second goblet into the water. There you can see we've got that temperature device in the water. We've also got the microphone position right above the water, and we've got our AV team with the handheld cameras ready to capture the exact moment when it enters into the bucket.
If you want to lay it down, you sure may, but if you want to take a break, you can too.
So we're going to save that one, right, David? No.
We're not going to save it. So if I understand correctly, they're going to re-punty that from the inside and then deliver it into the bucket. Any questions here in the audience? Okay, let me know. Any questions up here in the audience? Krista, do you have a question? What's your question? The question is, are you going to try and get it to stay all in one piece when it enters into the water? Not tonight. That's not the goal tonight. Yeah, good question, though. I was wondering that, too. Yeah, that would be a fine result if that ended up happening, to be able to take it out. Oh, yeah.
I've also got a question here from Amanda about how does the temperature of the water affect how violent the quenching is? Did you play around that with RIT at all?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to do it like with ice water or preheated water or to brines or other things to see.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd like to do that actually with the crackle glass as well. To try
change maybe add a solution to it or something.
To make it cooler or something.
Right.
Because it certainly should. The more energy you're pulling out more quickly will force a different sort of reaction. But if you did it into something that actually boiled more easily, like, I don't know, vodka, then you'd get a lot more gas coming off as it goes in as well. And you might get some fire as well, which would be good.
That'd be fun. We all love fire.
We do.
So David's going to create the punty here and then kind of pluck that cup out of the garage. But that's interesting to think about. We start here with room temperature water and then change that one variable and then compare the results, right? So kind of a very scientific way of looking at it.
So when he cracks it off, we'll go into our silent mode here again, please, until he tells us it's okay to express.
Every time we're in the garage, we have a cold side and a hot side. So we usually place things in and then move it over to the hot side. The flame is over on David's left. So he's going to kind of position it closer to the flame, and that way it's going to heat it up. So the temperature reading on the garage is at the opposite side. So the thermocouple is reading 1,015 degrees. But over towards the flame, it's probably closer to maybe 1150. And those 100, 120 degrees really make a huge difference when you introduce something into that 2,000 degree reheating furnace. But there you can see it's in one piece. So that went really well. And David's kind of judging the temperatures. When he's ready, he's going to put it into the water. And then, we just ask for just kind of a minute or so of silence. Here we go.
Okay. So that was different.
So that's kind of all I had planned. I don't know if there are questions or if maybe we can just do one more cup of fun, or I don't know how you guys would like to.
Yeah, so we're going to look at the results, maybe compare the two. But yeah, we'd just like to thank everyone for joining us. We want to thank you, David Schnuckel, for being our guest artist here tonight. Tom.
If you folks here would like to continue to ask questions, stick around. That'd be great.
Yeah, we'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you, Dr. Jane Cook, for joining us tonight for our special presentation. And be sure to visit our website, cmog.org. Stick around if you have questions. Thanks so much. Take care. Good night.